Dr. Beda, it's great to see you.
Great seeing you.
And this is one of our recent graduates, Ramy Barhouche. He has a degree in conflict resolution and also nonprofit management.
Hello.
Ramy, nice to meet you.
Nice meeting you too.
We're so excited to talk about your book. Well, we got a sneak peek. It's not out yet. Your book is amazing, by the way. So such a great read.
I really loved it. Yeah, I really loved it because I wasn't expecting how much logging affected the growth and development of Oregon. So it was quite interesting, interesting to see that.
Really, you can't separate the history of the state from logging and the way logging transformed not only the economy, but also the demography, as well as the, as I go into some later chapters, also the politics.
You also mentioned the connection between environmentalism and logging town. Can you explain that a little bit?
Well, one of the big arguments of my book, and one of the things I hope people take away from it, is that they understand that the lumbermen, the employers running this town, they really had no interest in sustainability. The famous term that they use that many people have probably heard is cut out and get out. They wanted to harvest all the trees and then leave the region, essentially leaving with their money in tow. But the people who are actually working in these towns, the people who are living in these towns, they have a much different view of the environment and view of nature. The first thing they realize is that cut out and get out logging is not going to serve them well, because they'll have jobs while the cutting's being done, but if the employer is just going to leave, where they're going to be with a job in 5, 10, 15 years. So workers are very concerned about the long-term economic sustainability of the forest. And I find evidence of this going all the way back to the 19 teens. These towns were so rugged and so primitive that workers and their families, they really had to rely on the forest for their basic necessities. So hunting, fishing, forest foraging, that was a part of their daily life. So the forest wasn't simply an economic space for them. It was also very much a space of subsistence, but also a cultural space. They understood their community as being very much rooted in place. And this story really takes off, I think, in important ways in the 40s and 50s, that as a consequence of the Depression, a lot of timber working communities, start to fear that their worst fears are coming true, that employers are now starting to disinvest from the region. So when unions begin to organize in the late 1930s, they make preserving forest land a key component of their mission and their idea of what unionism should be. So the main union I study is the International Woodworkers of America, the IWA. And they were founded in 1937. In 1938, they really throw their political weight behind the creation of Olympic National Park. So if you go to Olympic National Park today, it's not solely because of the political efforts of timber workers, but they were a key constituency and a key demographic that really provided political support for that bill.
I mean, I think we have this narrative, in the popular culture of loggers being sort of on the polar opposite end of urban environmentalists. And I think you problematize that a little bit. Can you sort of explain what urban environmentalists have in common with loggers and what they don't?
Okay, so what I call the term I use, and I didn't invent this term, but the term I use is working class environmentalism to explain loggers, is that they are a group of people who recognize multiple values of forests, that they saw, as I explained earlier, the forest as a valuable economic space, but also as a valuable cultural space, a valuable social space. Then there is this kind of other strain of environmentalism, which we see start to emerge in the 60s and 70s, where urban environmentalists, who they are coming more from cities, that their relationship to rural nature, at least, is more recreational, that they see the forests, they see, mountains, they see these places to go and to camp and to hike. When they advocate for the environment, it is really about protecting that sort of use of nature. That these are two groups who both passionately love the forest. And that's one of the most frustrating things about this, is that these people are fighting tooth and nail, and they're fighting because they both love nature and they want to protect their relationship to nature. I mean, where I think they differ, they differ in a big way in class status, is that a lot of these urban environmentalists, they are overwhelmingly white, overwhelmingly middle class. They have the sorts of jobs and they have the affluence that allows them to recreate and take vacations and spend a lot of time outdoors. And they don't necessarily think about other kind of how class shapes their understanding of nature and the ways in which some people, timber workers key in this story, really have to rely on nature for their jobs. And then there's kind of a whole nother third group of radical environmentalists, and they're a key important part of the story because while many environmentalists were opposed to logging, radical environmentalists, most notably Earth First, they were willing to go to sometimes extreme measures to prevent logging, that's say spiking trees, destroying logging equipment. So that really has a huge impact on some of the conflict that emerges because, there might have been a time when, loggers and environmentalists had worked together in the 40s, 50s, and in the 60s. So there was this political tradition of seeing one another as allies. But radical environmentalists, when they start, more or less attacking timber workers, spiking trees, destroying logging equipment, that really makes conversation and compromise a lot more difficult.
I worked with one group when I was younger that started in the 70s. I'm not going to mention their name. But when they started, that was their methods of doing so, like doing chains and like stopping that kind of things, or painting logs, big logs, and
okay. All right. Part of the story here is also popular culture. That in the 50s, but especially in the 60s and in the 70s, there's a lot of new cultural products. The most famous one we have here in Oregon is Sometimes a Great Notion by Ken Casey. And these cultural products really portray timber working communities as backwards, as part of this outmoded frontier culture, as people who are unwilling to change and who have no long-term interest in the environment. So later in the late 60s into the 70s, when environmentalists from urban areas are starting to fight with timber workers, the image they have in their mind is not the timber workers who supported the Wilderness Act. The image they have in their mind is the stampers from Ken Casey's book. And on the flip side, too, there's some cultural products, particularly articulated in country music, that's being produced in rural logging communities that starts to portray environmentalists as these kind of, elite, out of touch, fancy, stupid environmentalists who don't understand their work.
Okay, you gotta tell us the name of the country song.
So actually, my favorite, the guy who I spend a lot of time talking about in my book, his name is Buzz Martin. He was called the Singing Logger. And he's kind of the Johnny Cash of the Pacific Northwest.
Okay.
And actually, Johnny Cash was a fan of Buzz Martin. So he's singing a lot of songs about essentially the pride of work and, again, how outsiders always want to come in and, tell loggers who know the forest, want to tell loggers what to do with the land. So the actual title of my book is Strong Winds and Widow Makers, and that is the title of a Buzz Martin song.
How do you feel about logging?
Well, how do I feel about it? I think it's really a hugely important part of our modern life. The bookshelves behind you, what are they made of, right? Bookshelves behind me, what are they made of? We all live in a house or an apartment or something. What's that made of? It's made of lumber. And where does that timber come from? It doesn't just magically spring into existence in the aisle of a Home Depot. And that's one of the things I think loggers have always understood, that is that, we need this timber to make life possible. Well, we can't just cut every tree. We have to find some balance there. So I believe that logging could and should and must necessarily be part of our economy. I think, we have to find balance, but I think there's nothing inconsistent about having some areas that we protect as wilderness and some areas we manage for logging.